had a small stroke. They brought papers, tiny print, kind voices. "Just to help, Mom," they said. I signed. Weeks later, I came home. My key didn't turn. The door cracked open. My daughter-in-law stood there. "You don't live here anymore." I thought it had to be a mistake. Then I heard one line I wasn't meant to hear, and everything changed. Before I show you what I heard and how I fought back, tap subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and please share this with one person you love. This can happen to anyone. Now let's get into it. My name is Helen Moore. When I look at my hands, I see every night shift, every double shift, every tear wiped away from a stranger's cheek. For 40 years, I was a nurse, and for almost as long, a single mother. My son David was born when I was only 29, and by the time he was 3, his father had left. I remember the day he drove off. David clinging to my leg, my own heart pounding in my chest, the sky heavy and gray as though it knew what was happening. That's when I decided I would never let David feel abandoned. Whatever it took, he would always know he was loved. I bought our house a year later. It was small, a tired-looking 2-story with faded green shutters, but it was mine. I painted the walls myself, patched the roof when it leaked, and made it a home. We planted a crabapple tree in the backyard. Every spring it bloomed pink and white, and David would climb its branches to read his comic books. I kept a camera ready for those moments, his knees dangling, a sandwich in one hand, a superhero in the other. The house became a scrapbook of our lives, each corner holding a story. The kitchen was where we celebrated his high school acceptance. The living room floor still bore the dent from the time he built a blanket fort so big it collapsed the coffee table. The bedroom upstairs, once his, now held boxes of his childhood toys, waiting for the day he'd have a family of his own. But David grew restless as he got older. He was charming, bright, and endlessly persuasive, but also impulsive. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters, convinced he'd make money in other ways. Some of those ways landed him in trouble: unpaid loans, a failed business, a few nights at the county jail for a bar fight. I went to court once, standing behind him like a shadow while he faced the judge. The clerk whispered, "He's lucky to have you." And I believed it. I told myself he just needed another chance, and another after that, and a mother's heart doesn't switch off like a light. When David met Olivia, things seemed to settle. She was elegant, poised, always impeccably dressed. The first time she came to the house, she brought a bottle of expensive wine I couldn't pronounce. "For you, Mrs. Moore," she said, smiling, though her eyes never really met mine. I tried to welcome her, to see what David saw. But there was a distance to her, a coolness. She would look around the house as if assessing it, her gaze lingering on the antique dresser my mother had left me, the crystal bowls in the dining room. I thought maybe she just didn't know how to be warm. People can be shy in different ways, I told myself. As time passed, David came around less often. He and Olivia moved into a rental across town and then another even farther away. Holidays became brief visits, then phone calls. Sometimes Olivia would answer and say, "We're just so busy, Helen. We'll try next week." I'd set the table anyway, just in case they showed up. I'd keep his favorite apple pie cooling on the counter until late at night, then wrap it in foil and freeze it. Still, I didn't let it harden me. My home stayed open, my heart even more so. When my neighbor Susan Blake would stop by with her sharp tongue and warm laugh, she'd mutter things like, "That girl's got her claws in him, Helen. Mark my words." I'd shush her. "She's just different, Susan. Not everyone shows affection the same way." I defended them both, even when I felt the sting of their absence. Then, last winter, I had a minor stroke. It was brief, but terrifying. I woke up in the hospital where I used to work. A thin tube in my arm, monitors beeping around me. David was at my bedside, looking pale and concerned. Olivia stood a few feet back, scrolling on her phone. "Mom," David said, gripping my hand, "you scared us. You can't keep doing everything yourself. You need to let us help." He was right. For the first time in my life, I felt small, fragile. The hospital released me after a few days, but I was slower. My hands trembled when I wrote checks. David started coming over, fixing things around the house, going through my mail. Olivia brought groceries and arranged my medications in little boxes. They were attentive, almost eager. It felt like an answer to years of prayers. My son was stepping up at last. I wanted to believe in that so badly. One evening over tea, Olivia leaned in, her voice gentle. "Helen, with everything going on, it might be simpler if David handled your finances for a while, just until you're stronger. Banks can be a headache. We'll keep everything organized. You just focus on getting better." David nodded beside her. "Yeah, Mom. We've got this. It's temporary. You don't have to worry about a thing." I looked at their faces, my son's earnest, his wife's serene. My heart swelled. They were taking care of me, just as I had taken care of him. "All right," I said softly. "If you think that's best." Olivia smiled and reached into her bag. "It's just a few forms for the bank, nothing complicated. Power of attorney stuff. I brought a notary to make it official so you don't have to go anywhere." I hesitated for a second, but then David squeezed my hand. "It's okay, Mom. It's just paperwork. You're still in charge of everything." So I signed. I didn't read every line. The print was small and my head still ached from the stroke. I trusted them. My son. My family. Looking back now, I can still hear the pen scratching on the paper, my signature gliding across lines that would later haunt me. At the time, it felt like a relief. For the first time in months, I thought, I'm not alone in this. If only I'd known what that signature really meant. The weeks that followed felt like some strange, suspended dream. Quiet, slow-moving, oddly peaceful. I wasn't used to being taken care of. My body was healing but sluggish. I found myself napping in the middle of the day, losing track of dates, waking up with vague confusion. The kitchen felt foreign without my hands preparing breakfast. The garden, once my sanctuary, became overgrown while I watched it from my window. It wasn't depression, not quite, just a gentle letting go. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't fight it. David and Olivia visited more frequently. They brought food, sorted mail, and paid bills. Olivia even brought her laptop and began organizing what she called Mother's Financials, a folder I didn't even know existed. I'd find her in the dining room, softly typing, muttering numbers under her breath, while David adjusted curtains or replaced light bulbs. "Your son's really shaping up," Susan said one afternoon when she dropped by with soup. "Miracles do happen." I smiled faintly. "He's trying. They both are." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Mm-hmm." She never said much more than that. Just enough to get me thinking, never enough to push. I should have listened harder. Sometimes I'd catch Olivia looking at things in the house, the silverware set from my mother, the antique mirror in the hallway. She never said anything, but her eyes lingered. There was something clinical in the way she studied things, like she was cataloging. I told myself it was nothing. A person can drive themselves crazy looking for problems where there aren't any. So I did what I'd always done, gave the benefit of the doubt. One morning, David arrived holding a steaming cup of my favorite cinnamon tea and sat beside me on the porch. "Mom, how are you feeling today?" "Tired," I said truthfully, "but better." He looked off toward the overgrown rose bushes. "I've been thinking, you shouldn't have to stress about money right now, or bills, or running this place alone." "I know," I said cautiously, "but it's my house, David. I've always managed. You have, and you've done amazing, but it's different now. You need rest. Let me help." Before I could respond, Olivia stepped out with a manila envelope in hand. "Morning, Helen," she said brightly. "We thought we'd take one more thing off your plate." She sat beside me, opened the envelope, and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are just some forms for the bank, power of attorney so David can sign checks and deal with the utilities. We've included a basic transfer agreement, too. Nothing serious, it just helps things run smoother legally, keeps things in the family." I blinked at the words. Transfer agreement? Olivia smiled too quickly. Just procedural. You'll still live here, of course, but it'll simplify things if something happens, God forbid. David leaned forward. Mom, it's like a will, but in reverse. We're just helping. I don't know, I started, the words catching in my throat. You trust us, don't you? He asked. And I did, or at least I had, my entire life. Olivia opened the folder. We had a notary come by earlier this morning. She's still outside in her car. Everything moved fast after that. Too fast. I remember holding the pen, my hand shaking slightly. Olivia touched my shoulder and said, We'll take care of everything. All you need to do is focus on getting better. So I signed. The notary came in briefly, a pleasant woman with a clipboard and little else to say. She witnessed my signature, stamped a few pages, and left just as quickly. Afterward, I remember Olivia folding the papers with a small sigh of relief. There, she said, that's done. David smiled. You'll thank us later, Mom. I smiled back, trying to ignore the knot forming deep in my stomach. Maybe it was just the stroke recovery. Maybe it was nothing. Still, that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed and stared out the window at the crab-apple tree. It had lost most of its leaves. The branches looked skeletal under the moonlight. Susan came by the next day with groceries and a new scarf she'd knitted. They've been coming around a lot lately, she said casually as she put away canned soup. Nice of them. They're just helping, I said, trying to sound firm. Susan turned, her hands on her hips. Helping or taking over? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because somewhere deep inside, something had already begun to twist. Weeks passed. My strength returned slowly. I began walking more, cooking again, even trimmed the rose bushes one morning when the air was crisp. I felt good, lighter, like I was coming back to myself. David and Olivia, however, started showing up less and less. They've been busy, I told Susan, though she hadn't asked. Work, I think. One Sunday, I called David to see if he'd come by for dinner. He didn't answer. An hour later, Olivia texted, We're tied up this weekend. Hope you're okay. I stared at the message. No punctuation, no warmth. A few more weeks passed. I didn't hear from them at all. Then I got a message from an old friend in the neighborhood. Saw a moving van outside your house. Everything okay? I frowned. What van? I stepped outside and looked across the yard. Nothing unusual, but a deep unease settled over me. Susan, who had come over to drop off a pie, saw the look on my face. What is it? I shook my head. Probably nothing. But it wasn't. And it wouldn't be long before I found out just how wrong I had been to trust them so completely. It was a cool Friday morning in early April when I decided to visit an old friend in a neighboring town. Susan insisted I take the trip. She said I needed a change of scenery, even if just for a week. My legs had regained their strength, my appetite had returned, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself. I packed a small suitcase, tucked a photo of David as a child into my purse, just for company, and left the house with the front porch light on, the way I always did. The visit was lovely. My friend Margaret and I spent hours sitting on her patio, reminiscing over stories that spanned decades. She laughed when I told her David had finally taken over my finances. Well, she said, sipping her tea, maybe it's his time to be the grown-up for once. But even in the comfort of Margaret's home, I felt something I couldn't explain, like a pebble stuck in the bottom of my shoe. That little twist in my gut never truly left. I returned home on a Wednesday afternoon. The sky was overcast, a low grumble of thunder in the distance, and the smell of wet pavement filled the air. I turned into my street, slowing as my little house came into view. The crabapple tree was in bloom. The grass looked freshly mowed, which was odd, considering I hadn't asked anyone to tend to it. I pulled into the driveway and got out, dragging my small suitcase up the walkway. I reached for my keys, feeling the comforting jingle in my palm as I approached the front door. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't turn. I frowned, tried again, jiggled it, forced it a little. Still nothing. I stepped back, confused. Had the lock jammed? Maybe someone had changed the cylinder for security. But who would do that? I knocked, lightly at first, then again, louder. Footsteps approached. The door opened halfway. Olivia. She stood in the doorway in a neatly pressed white blouse, hair pulled back into a tight bun, holding a cordless phone in one hand. Her expression was neutral, not surprised, not concerned. "Oh," she said. "Helen, you're back early." "Early?" I said, blinking. "I said Wednesday." She looked past me toward the driveway, as though confirming I had, in fact, returned. "Well, I wasn't expecting you until evening." I gestured to the lock. "Why won't my key work?" There was a pause, just a fraction too long. Then she said it. "Because you don't live here anymore." I felt a flicker of confusion, then something colder, sharper. "What are you talking about?" Olivia tilted her head slightly. "David said he'd explain. But since you're here..." She stepped outside and shut the door behind her. "This property belongs to David now. You signed the transfer weeks ago, remember? It's legally his. The locks were changed for security reasons." I stared at her, my throat suddenly dry. "Security from what? This is my home." She blinked. "It was, but not anymore." I laughed, incredulous. "You must be joking." "I'm not," she said, her voice calm, almost bored. "You signed the documents willingly. You gave David full ownership. It's all filed and recorded." "I never agreed to this," I whispered. "You did. Maybe you didn't read it, but you did sign it. That's on you." I looked at the front door, my door, and the windows behind it. I could see my curtains, the picture frame of David at age 10 still sitting on the hallway table. My breath caught in my throat. "I want to speak to my son," I said. "He's not home," she replied. "When will he be back?" Olivia shrugged. "That's not really your concern anymore." "Let me get my things," I said quickly. "My clothes, my..." "No, we've packed what you left. You'll receive a box at Susan's later this week." My hands were trembling. "You're throwing me out?" "We're just following legal procedure, Helen. You gave him the house. We're asking you to respect that." I stood there, stunned. Cars passed on the road behind me, unaware. Birds chirped in the trees above. But everything in my world had stopped moving. "I have nowhere else to go," I said. "I'm sorry," Olivia said, but her face didn't match her words. Then she turned and went back inside. The door clicked shut. I stood frozen for a full minute, maybe 2. Then slowly, I turned and walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the front door. My home. It started to rain. I didn't call anyone. I didn't move. I just sat there, with my hands on the steering wheel, letting the water streak across the windshield. I had no keys, no plan, no answers. By evening, the sky had gone dark. The porch light turned on automatically, the one I always left on when I went away. I slept in my car that night, parked in front of the home I spent 40 years building. Every few hours I woke up, hoping this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. It wasn't. At dawn, I drove to Susan's. Susan opened the door in her robe, eyes widening when she saw me standing there, rain-drenched, hollow-eyed, suitcase still in the trunk of my car. "Helen?" she said, voice tight with concern. "What happened?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, shaking my head. Susan didn't ask again. She stepped aside and let me in. She wrapped me in a towel, handed me a cup of warm coffee, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. The air between us was heavy. My throat burned from holding it in. But once I started, I couldn't stop. "They changed the locks," I whispered. Susan's brows drew in. "Who?" "Olivia. She said the house belongs to David now." Susan blinked. "What?" "She said I signed it over." The words felt like ash in my mouth. Susan leaned forward. "You didn't sign anything like that." I don't know. There were papers. Remember? The ones she said were for power of attorney. She brought a notary." "You didn't read them?" I trusted them, I said, tears finally spilling. He's my son, Susan. I didn't think I needed to. Susan's face twisted with anger. She stood up and grabbed her phone. We're calling someone. This isn't right. It's not legal. I don't even know where to start, I murmured. Susan pursed her lips and began scrolling. I do. By afternoon, we were sitting in a warm, book-lined office with a soft-spoken man named James Patel, an elder law attorney Susan had known through a mutual friend. James wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the kind of voice that made you feel safe just listening to it. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, then asked, "Do you still have any copies of what you signed?" "No," I said, heart sinking. "Olivia took them, said she'd file everything." James nodded. "We can request the deeds from the county office. If there was a transfer of ownership, it'll be recorded publicly." The word transfer made my stomach clench. True to his word, James called someone immediately and arranged for expedited records. He turned to me after hanging up. "We'll have an answer by tomorrow." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in Susan's guest room, staring at the floral wallpaper, listening to the ticking clock. I thought about every birthday David had, how I scraped together money for presents, how I worked back-to-back shifts to pay for his school trips, how I stayed up sewing his Halloween costumes. I thought about how he cried the first time he scraped his knee and how I'd kissed the wound and promised to keep him safe. And now, he'd stolen my home. The next afternoon, James called. He asked us to come in. He didn't sugarcoat it. "There was a quitclaim deed filed 5 weeks ago," he said. "It lists you as the grantor and David as the grantee. You legally transferred the home to him." I felt my ears ring. "But I didn't mean to," I said hoarsely. "I didn't understand." He nodded. "I believe you. Unfortunately, that doesn't change the fact that it's legal. Unless we can prove coercion, fraud, or mental incapacity, the deed stands." Susan crossed her arms. "What about the notary? If Helen was misled, that has to count for something." "It does," James said, "but it's tricky. Notaries aren't responsible for the content, just for verifying the signer's identity and willingness." My eyes filled again. "So that's it? It's over?" James shook his head. "Not if we fight. I've handled elder abuse cases before. It takes time, and it won't be easy, but it's possible, especially if we can find inconsistencies in their story or evidence that the documents were misrepresented." Susan leaned toward me. "Helen, we do this. You don't let them get away with this." I wiped my tears and nodded slowly. James continued, "Do you remember anything else about that day? The way the papers were presented? Any red flags?" I took a shaky breath. "Olivia said it was just power of attorney, for bills and banks. She never said anything about transferring the house. Was David there?" I nodded. "He told me it was just to make things easier. Temporary," he said. James jotted something down. "That's good. The language they used matters, and if we can show a pattern of manipulation..." He trailed off, then turned to Susan. "You mentioned she's your neighbor. Have you ever overheard or seen anything that suggests they were planning this?" Susan's mouth tightened. "No, but Olivia once told me months ago that the house was too valuable to be left in the hands of a sick old woman." I thought she was joking. James's eyes narrowed. "That might help. And if she said similar things elsewhere..." He stood. "We start by filing for an injunction to block any sale of the house. Then we'll file a petition to reverse the transfer on grounds of elder exploitation. It'll take a while, but we can do it." As we left his office, the wind had picked up. The sky was pale, drained of color, but inside me, something stirred. Not quite hope, but something close. That evening, I stared at a photo of David in Susan's hallway, one I'd given her years ago. He was 7 in the picture, grinning with cake on his face. I touched the frame, whispering, "Why?" He was my son. But now, he was a stranger. The day James filed the injunction, I expected fireworks. I expected David to call me in a rage or show up on Susan's doorstep with apologies or accusations. But there was silence. Not a phone call. not a knock, not even a text. 3 days later, I got a message. "Mom, why are you doing this?" Just that. No greeting, no explanation, nothing. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering above the keys. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to believe he didn't understand, that he wasn't behind all of it, that Olivia had somehow tricked him too. But deep down, I knew better. Susan leaned over when she saw my face. "He finally wrote?" I nodded and handed her the phone. She read the message and scoffed. "You should write back, because you stole my damn house." Instead, I deleted the message and powered the phone off. The next day, James called. He had submitted the documents. The injunction would temporarily freeze any sale or mortgage activity on the property. It was a small step, but it gave me room to breathe. But it also meant David and Olivia would be served soon. "They'll respond," James said, "most likely through a lawyer. Maybe they'll try to contact you again. Don't engage. Let me handle it." I nodded, though my stomach nodded. I couldn't imagine David lawyering up. He hated paperwork. He never read fine print. He always said, "People who hire lawyers have something to hide." A week later, James called again. We received their legal response. I braced myself. They're claiming the transfer was intentional, that you wanted to give the house to David while you were still alive, as part of some early inheritance plan. My heart sank. That's a lie. They also claim you were of sound mind, that the notary confirmed everything, and that you were fully informed. They're painting me like I just handed it over? Yes, and they submitted a signed statement from Olivia as corroboration. I felt the blood drain from my face. Susan, who had come with me, clenched her fists. "She's lying," I said. "She never said anything about inheritance. She said it was just for bills, for convenience." James nodded. "And that's what we'll argue. But it means we're heading to court." I sat back in my chair. My house, my name, my life. Now reduced to paperwork and courtroom drama. A few nights later, I got another message from David. "You said I could have it. I did what you wanted. Why are you turning this into a war?" It took every ounce of strength not to reply. I drafted a dozen responses. "I never said that. You lied to me. You let her throw me out." But in the end, I sent nothing. Silence was louder. A few days later, Susan and I were in the grocery store when I ran into Margaret, the friend I'd visited weeks before. She gave me a puzzled smile. "Helen, everything okay?" I was surprised to hear from Olivia. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "She called me. Said you were staying with her permanently, that you'd handed over the house and decided to downsize. She made it sound like you were happy to start fresh." I stared at her, stunned. "She said that?" Margaret nodded. "I thought it was strange. Didn't sound like you. But she was so calm, I figured I'd misunderstood." Susan muttered, "Unbelievable." It wasn't just the house. Olivia and David were rewriting my entire story. Later that evening, I got a manila envelope in the mail from David's attorney. Inside were copies of the signed documents. I stared at them for hours, holding them up to the light, hoping they would somehow erase themselves. My own signature stared back at me, neat, steady, unmistakable. How had I not seen what I was signing? I remember the moment vividly now, the smell of Olivia's perfume, the heat from David's hand on my shoulder, the way they smiled at each other when I put pen to paper. I wanted to be taken care of. I wanted to trust, and they had used that to hollow me out. "They're saying I gave it to them," I whispered to James the next day, like it was a gift. James looked at me gently. "It wasn't a gift. It was a theft disguised as kindness, and that's what we'll prove." He had started preparing witness lists, people who could attest to my character, my mental clarity, my intentions. Susan would testify. Margaret, too, once she knew the truth. Even my old mail carrier, who used to wave at me every morning as I picked up the paper. He'd known me for years. We had to show that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't senile, that I had been misled by the people I trusted most, the people I called family. And while James began building the case with slow, methodical precision, I sat at Susan's kitchen table with a yellow notepad and started writing down everything I remembered. Every phrase Olivia used, every facial expression, every lie. The notepad filled quickly. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. James moved like a quiet storm, calm on the surface, but you could feel the force beneath everything he did. In the days that followed, he filed for discovery and began sending requests for communication records, financial transfers, and Olivia's employment history. He explained it to me gently. "We're looking for cracks, Helen. The more pressure we apply, the more likely they'll slip." Susan became my rock. She drove me to appointments, kept me laughing with stories, and reminded me to eat. But even she couldn't mask her anger when we discovered that Olivia had already started renovations on the house. Through a neighbor, we learned they'd hired a company to modernize the kitchen and were planning to list it for sale within the next few months. "They're flipping your life," Susan said bluntly, slamming the refrigerator door. "You should have seen the truck that pulled in last week. Fancy-looking men with clipboards and catalogs." I tried not to imagine it. My kitchen with the yellow tiles David had once helped me scrub. The chipped counter where I'd made every Christmas pie. Strangers measuring it like it was a commodity. James was furious. "This strengthens our claim," he told me. "They're acting in bad faith, rushing to liquidate what should still be yours." The court granted a preliminary injunction. David and Olivia were ordered to halt any sale or transfer of the property until the case was resolved. It was a small but vital victory. Then came the break we didn't expect. Susan, while scrolling through old voicemails she had saved on her landline's digital recorder, stumbled across a message from David. "Hey, Susan, it's David. Listen, we'll be handling Helen's place going forward, just so you know. She's not really up for stuff anymore. She doesn't even know what she's signing half the time. Olivia's taking care of it. We'll make sure the bills are paid and the house is taken care of." Susan looked at me, her jaw slack. He admitted it, on record. She forwarded the file to James immediately. He grinned, the first real smile I'd seen from him. This is gold. But we weren't done. Through more records, James discovered that Olivia had withdrawn nearly $18,000 from one of my accounts shortly after the deed transfer, a joint account I didn't even know she had access to. The withdrawal was labeled as maintenance fees, a term so vague it was laughable. "She's using your own money to fund the upgrades to sell your home," James said, practically vibrating with restrained outrage. "We're adding financial abuse to the case." It became clear just how calculated everything had been. This wasn't a spontaneous act of help gone wrong. It was a plan. One carefully stitched together between two people who had every intention of cutting me out of the picture. We gathered testimonies. Margaret, bless her heart, wrote a letter detailing Olivia's odd phone call. My doctor confirmed in writing that I had been mentally sound before and after the stroke. James pulled in a handwriting analyst to compare my signature on the deed against older ones. And even though they matched, the context helped build a pattern. Meanwhile, Olivia kept quiet. No phone calls, no visits, not even a passive-aggressive text. Susan called it the storm before the trial. One afternoon, while cleaning out her shed, Susan found an old cardboard box I had stored there years ago. Inside were dozens of old photos, birthday cards, and, buried at the bottom, a stack of bank statements I'd thought lost during a prior house cleanup. James flipped through them. These might be nothing, or they might show transaction patterns we can use to show inconsistency. Everything helps. He was right. One of the statements showed a transfer David had made without my knowledge 6 months prior. Smaller, but still unauthorized. It was the start of a pattern. The deeper we dug, the more rotten it all smelled. James requested permission to subpoena Olivia's personal phone records and emails. It was a long shot, but then she made a mistake. In a poorly redacted email to a mutual acquaintance, Olivia had written, "David needs to stop worrying. His mother will be fine. She'll adjust. She's lucky we're not putting her in a home." James pounced. "She's not just cold. She's arrogant and careless." With the trial looming closer, James began prepping me to take the stand. "You'll be nervous. That's natural. But the truth is your strength. Don't embellish. Just be real." I nodded. I had nothing to invent. My story didn't need decoration. One night, I found myself in the kitchen, running my fingers along Susan's countertop, imagining my own, wondering what Olivia had done to it. I pictured my tea kettle. Gone. The embroidered curtains I'd sewn, probably thrown away. The ceramic cookie jar David made me in middle school. I tried not to think about it. "They took everything," I said out loud. Susan, behind me, said softly, "Not everything. You still have your voice." That stayed with me. And when James handed me the binder of evidence a few days later, I felt something different. Not grief, not even anger. Readiness. It was time to face them. Not just for my house, but for every lie they'd told while smiling at my table. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, though it wasn't warm either, but in tone. Gray walls, polished tile floors, rows of stiff-backed benches where people sat trying to shrink into themselves. As Susan and I walked in, I felt like I was floating just behind my own body, observing it all through a pane of glass. James met us in the hallway. He looked calm, composed as always, holding a slim black folder under one arm. "You ready?" he asked me gently. "As I'll ever be." He smiled. "You're not here to perform, Helen. You're here to tell the truth. That's all." Courtrooms have a way of draining the warmth out of you. Ours was no different. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly above us. The judge, a middle-aged woman with short hair and sharp eyes, sat high behind her bench. Her expression was unreadable. A poker face honed by decades of watching people tear each other apart over property, custody, money. David was already there when we entered. He didn't look at me. He sat at the defendant's table and wearing a pressed suit that didn't suit him. Too stiff, too formal. He looked smaller than I remembered. Younger, almost. Or maybe that was just the weight of what was about to come down. Olivia sat beside him, poised and unreadable in a charcoal gray blouse, hair tied into a flawless chignon. Her expression never shifted. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. When the judge called our case, everything moved fast and slow all at once. Introductions, motions, objections. It was like stepping into a different language, one where the truth had to be carved into legal shape before anyone would listen. James started by laying out the case: elder exploitation, coercive transfer of property, financial abuse. He walked the judge through the timeline with quiet authority, citing documents, quoting Olivia's email, playing the voicemail David left Susan. I watched my son squirm for the first time. Then came the witnesses. Margaret spoke kindly and firmly. My doctor testified to my mental clarity. Susan, fierce as ever, took the stand and made sure they knew exactly who Olivia was behind that calm exterior. "She talks like she's doing you a favor," Susan said at one point, staring directly at Olivia. "But she planned this, piece by piece." And then it was my turn. James helped me to the stand, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder as I passed him. I sat, was sworn in, and adjusted the microphone. The judge looked at me and said, "You may begin." My mouth felt dry. My hands trembled slightly. "I was a nurse for 40 years, I began. "I raised my son alone. I paid off my mortgage penny by penny. That house wasn't just real estate, and it was where I built my life." I walked them through everything. From the stroke, to the papers I signed, to the night Olivia told me I no longer lived there. My voice cracked a few times, but I didn't cry. Not once. I wouldn't give Olivia that. When James asked what I believed I was signing, I answered clearly, "Power of attorney, for utilities, temporary help." "And were you ever told this was a deed transfer?" "No." "Were you ever told that you would lose ownership of your home?" "No." I saw Olivia whisper something to David, who stared straight ahead like a statue. Cross-examination was brutal. David's lawyer tried to suggest I was confused, that I had misremembered, that maybe I had said things I didn't recall. I kept my voice steady. "I've forgotten birthdays," I said at one point. "I've lost my glasses. but I never once told my son he could take my house away from me." Silence followed that. When I stepped down, I felt like I'd aged a decade. James gave me a nod as I passed. Not a smile, just a look that said, "You did it." David took the stand the next day. He avoided my gaze. He said what I expected, that I wanted him to have the house, that it was part of future planning, that I was tired and grateful. He told the court I hugged him afterward, that I smiled. "That's a lie," I said under my breath. James didn't interrupt. He let David talk, let him pile it on. Then came the questions. "David, why did you not inform your mother of the renovations?" "I thought she knew." "You thought she knew, even though she wasn't living in the home anymore?" He paused. "I assumed Olivia told her." "And did she?" David glanced at Olivia. She didn't blink. He answered, "I don't know." James pushed harder, slowly, methodically. Piece by piece, the cracks began to show, the contradictions, the slippery language, the moments he couldn't quite explain. Then it was Olivia's turn. She walked to the stand like she owned it, spoke calmly, denied everything, claimed I'd agreed enthusiastically. James brought up the voicemail, the email, the bank withdrawals. Olivia deflected, dismissed. Then James dropped the line that shifted the entire tone of the courtroom. "You described Helen in writing as a sick old woman. Do you still believe that?" Olivia stiffened. "I was venting." "To a mutual acquaintance?" "I didn't mean it literally." "But you did say it." She hesitated. "Yes." James paused, then addressed the judge. No further questions. The air in the courtroom felt electric. And for the first time since this all began, I saw Olivia blink, just once. But it was enough. I left that day drained but oddly clear. We hadn't won yet, but they had felt the weight. They knew now this wouldn't disappear quietly, and neither would I. The second day of court was worse than the first. I'd thought I'd heard everything I could possibly hear, all the lies, all the spins, all the cold rationalizations. But there's something about watching your own child, the boy you once held through fevers, who fell asleep with his head on your chest, sit in a courtroom and lie under oath that breaks something deeper than heartbreak. David sat across from me, his hands folded neatly on the desk, his voice measured, almost detached. When asked again if I had ever objected to the ownership transfer, he said clearly, "No." She thanked us. She said she didn't want the burden anymore. I physically felt the words land in my chest like a punch. I heard Susan gasp softly next to me. Even James, who had kept his composure through everything, seemed to stiffen slightly. The judge asked David to clarify. "So you're saying your mother verbally confirmed, in your presence, that she no longer wished to own the property?" "Yes, Your Honor." There was no stutter, no hesitation, not even a blink. He lied, cleanly, without flinching. I didn't cry. I stared at him, but he never met my eyes. James leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't react. We'll take him apart and cross." And he did. James stood, walked slowly to the podium, and picked up the printed email Olivia had sent, the one that referred to me as lucky for not being put in a home. "You've read this email?" he asked David. David glanced at Olivia. "Yes." "You didn't find that language disrespectful?" "I didn't write it." "But you were copied on it." "Yes." "You didn't object. Didn't ask her to retract it. You didn't say, 'Hey, maybe don't describe my mother that way.'" David shifted. "I trusted Olivia to handle things." James paused, then moved on. He pulled up bank statements, pointed to the $18,000 withdrawal. "Were you aware that this money was removed from your mother's account?" David blinked. "Yes, it was for repairs." "Repairs your mother didn't authorize?" "She signed over power of attorney." "Not ownership, there's a difference." David looked down. The judge interrupted. "Did you explain the deed transfer to your mother in plain language prior to signing?" David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I assumed she understood. "Did you explain it?" "No, Your Honor." James didn't press further. He didn't need to. Later, as we sat on a bench outside the courtroom during recess, I turned to James. "He looked me in the face and lied," I said. James nodded. "I know. It doesn't even bother him. He thinks he's doing the right thing. That's the worst kind of liar. The one who believes the lie makes him noble." When we went back in, Olivia took the stand again for a second round of questions. This time, James focused on her motivations. "You stated earlier that your role was supportive, that David made the decisions, but we have evidence that you initiated contact with realtors before the deed was even finalized. How do you explain that?" She blinked slowly. "I was planning ahead. Planning to sell a home that, legally, still belonged to someone else? I believed it was already his." "You believed?" "Yes." "Not new?" She hesitated. "It's a matter of interpretation." James raised a brow. "Isn't that a dangerous basis for financial decisions involving someone else's property?" Silence. He didn't need to say more. I watched the judge scribble a note. By the end of the day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. The confidence Olivia walked in with had dulled. David had grown quieter. Their lawyer, once so assertive, now kept his questions narrow, tight, cautious. Before the court adjourned for the day, the judge addressed the room. "This matter involves complex family dynamics, but the law is not swayed by sentiment. It is swayed by evidence. We will reconvene for closing statements on Friday." We left in silence. Outside, the wind was sharp. Susan wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck. "He lied about everything," I murmured. "And now everyone knows," she replied. We got into her car. Neither of us turned on the radio. When we got home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the dusky sky. Somewhere in that very moment, David and Olivia were probably sitting in my living room, maybe even in my chair, breathing air that still smelled faintly of my vanilla candles. Let them have it, for now. Because no matter what they touched, they couldn't rewrite the truth, and soon the judge would decide whose story held weight. Mine, the one etched in decades of memory, or theirs, carefully wrapped in legalese and fraud. I knew what was real, and I was ready for the end. Court resumed on Friday, and this time the air inside the room felt heavier, more watchful. Olivia sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. David looked tired. His suit was wrinkled at the elbows. For once, he didn't look at me with defiance or even avoidance. He looked afraid. James arrived calm, notes clipped neatly into a thin folder, and offered me a soft smile. "Today's the day," he said. "Let's finish it." The judge called the session to order. Closing arguments began. David's lawyer went first. He spoke of misunderstandings, intentions miscommunicated, and family matters turned tragic. He insisted David and Olivia had never meant harm, that they'd acted with care, even if the execution was imperfect. It was a decent performance, polished, but even the courtroom seemed unconvinced. Then James stood up. He walked slowly to the center. No theatrics, no raised voice, just his steady, grounded tone. "This case is not about miscommunication," he began. "It's about manipulation. It's about a woman who devoted her life to raising a son, only to be discarded like furniture when she became inconvenient. It's about trust, the kind we build over decades, being weaponized against someone too decent to suspect betrayal." He paced slowly. "This isn't a complicated case. It's painful, but not complicated. A home was taken under false pretenses, a signature obtained without full understanding, a vulnerable woman deceived by the people she should have been safest with." He paused. "Look at her." I didn't know he would do that, but every eye in the courtroom turned to me. This woman deserves not only her house back, but the dignity that was stolen along with it. He returned to his seat. Silence followed. The judge didn't offer her ruling immediately. She adjourned the court for a brief recess, saying she needed a moment to review one final submission. I sat there gripping Susan's hand. "Breathe," she whispered. "You did everything you could." I nodded, but my lungs didn't feel like they worked. 25 minutes later, we were called back in. The judge entered, stone-faced, and took her seat. "In the matter of Helen Moore versus David Moore," she began, "this court finds sufficient evidence of coercion and misrepresentation regarding the deed transfer in question. The legal burden for informed consent was not met." David shifted in his seat. "The transfer is hereby reversed. Ownership of the property shall be restored to Helen Moore, effective immediately." A sharp inhale from Olivia. David dropped his head into his hands. My ears rang. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I just sat there, stunned, as a tide of numbness washed over me. I had won. I had my home back. But all I could feel was tired. The judge continued with procedural language. Fees, injunction extensions, formal notices. But I barely heard any of it. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, James gave me a copy of the judge's ruling. "It's done," he said quietly. I took the paper, folded it, and slid it into my purse. Susan hugged me tightly. "We're going home," she whispered. "Where you belong." We waited a week before returning. James advised giving David and Olivia time to vacate. Apparently, they'd left the house 2 days after the ruling, quietly, without fanfare. No note, no apology, just gone. Susan drove me. I didn't say much during the ride. My heart was pounding like it hadn't in years. When we pulled into the driveway, I froze. The crabapple tree was in bloom. The lawn had been mowed recently. The windows sparkled. A contractor's sign still leaned awkwardly against the porch railing, but it was still my house. Susan offered to go in first. I shook my head. "I need to do it." I walked up the steps, key in hand, my key. It slid into the lock effortlessly. The door creaked open. Inside, everything felt different. The furniture was rearranged. My curtains were gone. The couch I loved had been replaced with something sterile and beige. My ceramic cookie jar was nowhere in sight. I walked through slowly. The kitchen had new granite countertops, cold, smooth, impersonal. The walls had been painted a pale gray. All the yellow was gone. It was my house, but it didn't feel like home. I stood in the middle of the living room, turning slowly, until Susan appeared behind me. "You okay?" "I don't know." She nodded. "We'll fix it. One picture, one curtain at a time." In the days that followed, I began reclaiming the space. I brought back my old chairs from storage. I found a vendor who recreated the floral curtains I'd sewn years ago. I replanted the garden bed with the same tulips I used to tend every spring. I even found a replacement for the cookie jar online. Not the same, but close enough. But no matter how much I redecorated, the silence in the house felt heavier than before. Not sad, just still. David never called. Neither did Olivia. Their absence, oddly, didn't ache the way I thought it would. It felt like scar tissue, tender, but no longer bleeding. James checked in a few weeks later. "How's the house?" he asked. "Mine again," I said. "That's enough." He smiled. "You ever need anything, you call me." And that was that. I'd gotten everything back, and yet, in some ways, I'd lost something I'd never get again. But life went on. Susan brought over tea. The crabapple tree bloomed harder than ever, and on quiet afternoons, I sat by the window with my knitting and reminded myself, home isn't just a place. It's the part of you no one gets to steal, not even your own child. The summer came quickly after the trial. Warmth returned to the house before I fully did. I spent most days on the porch, watching bees hover over the lavender, feeling the sun soak into my skin like a quiet kind of healing. But even as the garden came back to life, something inside me stayed quiet. David never called. Not after the judgment. Not after they left the house. Not even on my birthday. For the first time since he was born, there was no card in the mail with a rush signature, no phone call out of obligation, not even a blank message sent too late. He disappeared. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to block his number. Susan asked me once if I wanted revenge, if I wanted to pursue charges, go after more than just the house. "I don't want to see him behind bars," I said. "I just wanted him to say he was sorry." "But he isn't," she replied. "That's the problem." I didn't argue. She was right. People asked how I could stand to live in a house that had been tainted by betrayal. They didn't understand. The house wasn't what hurt me. It was what reminded me I'd once loved someone enough to give them the keys to my life. That love hadn't disappeared. It had just been put in a box and stored somewhere I no longer visited. I found myself talking to David sometimes, not aloud, not in anger, but in little mental letters. I'd stand in the hallway and remember the way he used to run down those stairs in his pajamas, and I'd think, "You were good once. Where did that boy go?" And the truth was, I don't know. Maybe I never will. One Sunday afternoon, while sorting through a drawer in the kitchen, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. David at 17, standing beside me with his diploma in hand, both of us smiling like we'd won the world. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. He was still my son, but I wasn't his mother in the way I had been. Not anymore. I didn't wish him harm. I hoped he found peace. I hoped Olivia moved on and he found someone who made him better, if he was capable of that. I hoped selfishly that sometimes he thought of me and felt the weight of what he'd done, but I didn't need him to come back, because I had come back to my house, to myself, to a life without the illusion that love guarantees loyalty. One morning, as I clipped roses in the garden, Susan leaned over the fence and said, "You look more like you every day." "I feel more like me," I said. And it was true. I had scars now, invisible ones, but they reminded me I'd survived something not everyone does, betrayal from within. And I was still standing, still here, still breathing. And the home that had once been a battleground was mine again, not because a court said so, but because I had refused to let them erase me, and no matter how much was taken from me, that part they couldn't touch. The part that made me Helen Moore. Outrow. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to watch them turn that trust into a weapon? What would you do if your own child locked you out of the life you built with your own hands? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, even a little, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Make sure you subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you know someone who's ever felt betrayed by the people closest to them, send this to them. There's more where this came from. In fact, our other stories are popping up on your screen right now. Go watch one of those next, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.